welcome back to X Squared Radio. I'm your host, Brooks Agnew, coming to you from just outside of Charlotte, North Carolina. My guest tonight is Diana West, author of American Betrayal. If you missed the first hour, you definitely need to go back and listen to this as an archive because you missed a lot. We're going to change gears in this hour and talk a little bit about the Manhattan Project and what went on there. There's so much amazing revelations in her book. And it's a fascinating project to begin with because of the so many layers of secrecy and that automatically lends itself to all kinds of espionage, which there certainly was. Before we get into that, I want to remind you our affiliate, The Food Investor, out in Utah, my friends Scott and Danny Barzee, are producing dehydrated foods that make excellent food storage items, great taste without preservatives. So this is a great set-it-and-forget-it food storage program. You buy it, put it in a bag by the front door, and it is ready to go anytime. You know, he's one of our favorite affiliates, and so please click on the Food Investor link at X Squared Radio. Also wanted to remind you that in October, the Breakthrough Energy Movement Conference is coming up, and there are going to be so many firsts at this conference. It's really amazing. Not only will there be leading-edge breakthrough energy projects and technologies that you can look at. Some of them can be used for the home, for your car, for all kinds of devices. It'll just get your mind working for all kinds of things you could use this stuff for. But also, Atlas Shrugged is going to have a presence there. There's a strong rumor that the trailer for Atlas Shrugged 3 will make its secret debut at the conference. And there'll be electric vehicles and all kinds of other neat stuff. It's going to be held in Boulder, Colorado, October 10th. If you want to find the link, it's easy. Just go to X Squared Radio. Right there in the center below the slideshow is a link to the Breakthrough Energy Movement Conference. Get there, get registered. It's easy to find. Welcome back, Diana. We're having an amazing discussion. I'm kind of a history hobbyist, I'm going to call it, because I'm a scientist and I love reading stuff. But I become fascinated when history becomes altered, it becomes washed over, becomes propagandized or approved and sanitized. And when documents of old begin to come forward and say, hey, wait a minute, that's not only not the whole story, that it isn't even close to the true story, that's when we really learn our weakness. That's when we begin to learn, hey, maybe we are repeating history because we're not telling the truth about what we did. And that's why I find your book, it's going to be fascinating when I get to read the whole thing. It's so new, folks. I haven't even had a chance to get my copy in yet. It's ordered, but it hasn't arrived yet. It just went live on Amazon 4 days ago. So it's rocketing to the top of the charts right now, I am sure. In this hour, I want to talk about the Manhattan Project. We just very briefly touched on it because of the espionage that took place inadvertently when the FBI tapped a communication. And they learned about a project that was so massive and so technical and so complex that even they didn't know was happening inside our country. And who did the cable go to when they discovered this? It went to the president and to Mr. Hopkins, which then went straight to the Soviets and let them know, hey, by the way, you guys just got tapped. So maybe they just got smarter after that. What do you think happened?
I think they continued on their merry way. I mean, they were not impeded. They were, in fact, assisted, again, by Harry Hopkins. I mean, this is kind of the truly another instance of just major American betrayal. We know about the famous Rosenberg spy ring. We know about the Soviet espionage. You know, we've read many books following this. Many documents reveal the various treasons involved. I mean, this is kind of an old story to us. What is not an old story to us, however, is the involvement of the Lend-Lease establishment, the machinery of this agency, in terms of providing the ingredients required for an atomic pile. I mean, this is literally what also went along that pipeline. And this is the story, again, of a man named Major George Racy Jordan, who I realize is so far the only American witness to come forward and claim that he witnessed Harry Hopkins in what he later realized was an act of treason. And just to refresh, Jordan was known as an expediter. He was the top American officer at this major air base in Great Falls, Montana, that was just speeding aircraft and supplies, just tons and tons of supplies, along the way through Alaska and then over into the Soviet Union during the war. And Jordan was all for it. I mean, he was a patriot. He was supporting his country in its war effort. He was actually had come back into service. He was not a young man. He was had been in World War I. I understand he actually was a flyer with Eddie Rickenbacker. He was a businessman. He came back into the uniform and was doing his job. And he was the liaison to the Soviet presence in Great Falls. And he ended up keeping notes, diaries, jottings of all manner of things while he was there. And this really became the best American record of what the Lend-Lease pipeline was like. He published a book, Harcourt at the time, in 1952 called From Major Jordan's Diaries. And this is his story of Lend-Lease. The public became aware of this first in 1949. This was the year that the Soviet Union shocked America by exploding an atomic bomb. And as the news broke and the discussions went on about how this could have happened and what was happening, Jordan came to understand by the various technical language that was suddenly in play that he had personally expedited essential ingredients, essential materials that went into the making of the Soviet bomb, including uranium. What do you think of that?
Well, I think that's stunning because, I did my postgrad work at Oak Ridge, and one of my...
I'm talking to the right man.
One of my suppliers that gave me things like sodium iodide crystals and detector software and stuff like that, because I used it to develop a ground-probing radar system for oil and gas industry. Anyway, he was a major in the Marines, and his job was to supervise the Manhattan Project team for security, not only to make sure they were kept safe, but also to make sure they didn't speak to anybody. And he told me just wonderful stories about those days. And one of the things that I discovered was in pursuing my nuclear chemistry degree was that no two fissile materials are identical. When these things are enriched, and they're the way to do that is you speed up neutrons with a very powerful centrifuge, electromagnetic centrifuge, and you slam them into the uranium. You enrich the uranium. Normally it's uranium-235, but by the time you finish loading it up with neutrons, it's really hot stuff. It's fissile material. It's very, very close to criticality when you compress it. And the first ideas about making an atomic bomb was to make what's called an atomic gun, where you take two chunks of uranium at either end of a tube and you literally use the tube as a cannon and you shoot the two pieces of uranium at each other inside that tube. And just from the concussion, there is some fission that takes place, and the whole thing comes apart. It goes critical and comes apart. After that, they learned to make shaped charges, and it wasn't until they confiscated quite advanced German prototypes of a very similar bomb that they were able to make huge leaps forward in technology. Of course, even that is very secret even to this day. But there are a lot of other components that you got to have. You got to have precision aluminum tubes, and you got to have heavy water.
Can I interrupt one moment?
Yeah, absolutely.
Jordan Yes, Jordan. One thing Jordan did was he got the Russians. He was very palsy-walsy with them, his counterpart, and he got the Russians to turn over essentially their manifest, their lists of what had been supplied, and he prints them in his book. And from my research, it's the best listing of Lend-Lease that I've seen anywhere, and these were what the Soviets gave him. One of the items was more than $13 million worth of aluminum tubes.
That's a lot of tubes in that year.
Sorry?
That's a lot of aluminum tubes in that year. $13 million went a long, long way. By the way, who supplied the aluminum?
I don't know. I don't know where the aluminum came from. Something else he shipped along, this will mean something to you as well, 834,000 pounds of cadmium metal, which I understand is necessary for controlling the intensity of the atomic pile. 13,000 pounds of thorium. This was just various shipments. And what is amazing is that General Leslie Groves, the chief of the Manhattan Project, did not know this, certainly about uranium, until 1949 and 1950, when Jordan went to testify before Congress. General Groves, had slapped an embargo on uranium specifically in 1943 after a shipment had gone through to the Soviets, something Jordan was actually not aware of. No longer could U.S. uranium be exported. And indeed, the uranium that Jordan shipped, he says, at Harry Hopkins' request, he says he got a phone call from Harry Hopkins about it, came from Canada. So in other words, Hopkins was going around the embargo placed by General Groves on the export of uranium.
That's why everything was going out through Canadian ports. And I maintain that the aluminum came from one of the Third Reich's major suppliers, Alcoa.
And where was that?
Alcoa was the largest aluminum supplier in the United States.
Ah. Very likely. I couldn't tell you.
Well, it's just kind of interesting how all this falls together. By the way, the first detonation was the atomic gun, but the second one was a fusion weapon where they were actually forcing hydrogen protons together to make helium, and thus releasing the energy. This was Einstein's brainchild, and the shaped charge and the tritium enriching that they used for that bomb made a bomb of amazing intensity, but they actually didn't know if they would light the atmosphere on fire when they set it off. So it was kind of a tense moment for everyone.
I bet.
And it's widely known now that the actual detonator for the bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki came from Germany.
Amazing.
Now, the interesting thing is, and this is kind of a surprise because we know now, after listening to the first hour and by paying close attention to the map, that the eastern flank was left open, that the troops that had been so successful beating Germany's armies up in South Africa made their way across the Med into Italy and were poised to go up through the center of Europe, right through the soft underbelly. And at the last moment, we're told to get back on boats, get back through the Med, go through the Straits of Gibraltar, go all the way around Spain because we're coming in on the northwest of France. Even the Germans could not figure out where we were. So stupid was the strategy. But it was perfect for an eastern invasion by Soviet Russia.
Exactly. It's a shocking thing to have to confront. But I think it is, again, the logic of the map, and now we have various forms of evidence that show this very evil plan taking shape, various players working for it. Meanwhile, you did have, and this is kind of the, I don't know if it's the uplift part of the book, but the inspiring, the part I find inspiring, you did have along the way a series of people that I call the truth tellers, who saw from wherever their piece of real estate was, they saw what was going on, and they tried to tell the truth either to the American people or to the president. And he had advisors, people who tried to be honest with him and tell him exactly what was happening with the Soviet Union, that this policy of appeasement would actually result in America having gone to war to defeat one monster and instead defeat that monster but leave an even greater monster in power. And this is exactly what happened. Again, when I started thinking about it, I realized that this notion of, quote, the good war that we always are taught World War II is, the morally black and white war, was another whitewash. How, again, going to the map, can one look at that map at the end of World War II and claim victory? Yes, Hitler was gone. However, the division of Europe that Hitler and Stalin had secretly arranged in the Nazi-Soviet pact of 1939 was absolutely in sway. Only Stalin was holding the territories. It was an absolute flim-flam game, and it was, the wool was pulled over our eyes, and it has only gotten more and more difficult to see the truth because as time goes by, the memories diminish and the narrative, the lore is set. It's set in stone now. And so, in a sense, I think it is time for a reappraisal for sure, and that is what I offer in the book. But it's a difficult one because it essentially requires people to invert the universe.
Well, I think that your book is, like water, and it's going to get into the cracks of this stone wall, and it's going to break it apart. It is that powerful. The book is called American Betrayal, and the title, as we discussed very early in the first hour, was not the title of the original book outline that Diana started with, but it became the title as she discovered, just as you're being stunned right now by learning this, she was learning it in volumes and in reams of information that she digested to write this incredible book. Now, let's talk a little bit about those truth tellers, because some of them were contemporaries and some of them came along later as the history is being written. But what happened to the truth tellers in a Washington, D.C. that is not only completely infiltrated with Soviet spies, but is almost operating like a de facto Stalin supply chain? What happened to the truth tellers in that environment?
Well, they tended to be chewed up and spat out, and depending on their own position and resources, they landed according to according to how hard life would treat them. For example, in terms of thinking of the one of the truth tellers is George Earle. This man I had mentioned earlier as being a former New Deal governor of Pennsylvania, came from a fancy family, kind of a swashbuckling type, and he had been one of Roosevelt's emissaries in Europe, came up with evidence of another betrayal we have not talked about yet, evidence that the Soviets had indeed perpetrated what's known as the Katyn Forest Massacre. This was the mass murder of some 20,000 Polish officers by the Soviets early in the war. And when the Germans reclaimed the area, Katyn actually, more recently in the headlines as Smolensk, which is the nearby city, because of the, some call it the assassination of the Polish leadership by Putin 3 years ago in a plane crash to commemorate the Katyn Forest Massacre, if you can imagine that. When they discovered the Germans reclaimed that territory and began unearthing the bodies of the dead Polish officers, they, in kind of kettle calling pot black style, were trumpeting to the world this Soviet atrocity. Now, the Soviet atrocity was committed by our Uncle Joe. That was Stalin's nickname by Roosevelt and Churchill, this disgusting nickname. They called him Uncle Joe. This was part of the propaganda. And it presented the Churchill and Roosevelt with a real conundrum, a moral quandary. And the way that they actually faced that quandary was to join the Soviet lie, was to participate in a big lie. Even at that date, it was possible to assess the evidence on the ground in Katyn and understand that only the Soviets could have committed this atrocity. And George Earle was someone who, in his travels, had amassed a dossier on Katyn, and he thought it was very important that the president know. And he came back to Washington, I believe it was about 1944 when he had this meeting, and he presented his dossier to Roosevelt. And Roosevelt was, as you mentioned earlier, very ill, really non-compos mentis at least half the time. Stanton Evans has a wonderful new book called Stalin's Secret Agents, and he argues that, Roosevelt was essentially brain dead the closer you get to the end of the war. Roosevelt dismissed Earle. Earle came back and actually asked permission to tell his truth, what he had discovered, and warn the American people that a new totalitarian entity was forming that would threaten us. And Roosevelt ordered him into silence, and Earle was also a go-between with that anti-Hitler German resistance we were talking about, so he'd really been through the internal wars with this administration. And what did Roosevelt do next? Earle went fishing after this terrible debacle, and he was fishing on a remote Maryland lake. It sounds extremely rural, out in a little boat. And what do you know, but a couple of FBI agents get in a little boat and putt-putt across the lake over to him, present him with his literal marching orders, and he was dispatched to Samoa. That's
Samoa.
One way to get a truth teller out of town.
Wow.
Samoa. Another man, early on, he's actually in the very beginning of the book, a man named William Wirt had this is before the war, early Depression, Roosevelt administration just in, New Deal just taking shape. William Wirt goes to a New Deal dinner party and hears revolution being planned. It's quite an extensive experience he had, and he began writing letters everywhere he could. He was an educator of note, so he had some standing, and one of his letters got to James Rand, an industrialist of note, at the time testifying before the Securities and Exchange Committee at the time, rewriting Wall Street according to New Deal standards. And Rand read the letter into the congressional record alleging revolution on the part of the New Dealers. And there were hearings. They were, I call them the very first show trial in America. Wirt was railroaded. He was not allowed to read his statement. He was not allowed counsel, which was a Senate tradition. He was not allowed to summon witnesses to prove whether what he was saying was true or not. The dinner party guests, we later find out, again, due to the opening of archives, 3 out of the 6 were KGB assets.
Wow.
They colluded in a story and told the world under oath that Wirt had not stopped talking and was the biggest bore and it was the worst dinner party ever. And Wirt was smeared and they say died of a broken heart. He left, he went back to his home in Indiana. A few years later, one of the Democrats on that committee that, in his words, turned the thumbscrews on Wirt, wrote a public confession admitting that there had been collusion in the stories, and that the Democrats had been there solely to shut the story down so that the New Deal would not be stopped.
And so
we don't know about him. He's not in our history books either. So this is what happens to them. Basically, they are marginalized, and then they are paved over. And history doesn't tell us about them unless you start digging.
And one of the things that we know about history in that time was that this agency government, this New Deal, which you hear about in your history books when you're in high school and junior high, this agency government that was established was set up so that secretaries, which the Constitution allows the president to have a cabinet, which are, advisors, people that know stuff, because the president can't know everything. And it doesn't mean anything if they're aligned with him or not. Preferably they are, because he's seeking advice from them as he runs things. But when Roosevelt came to power as the world-famous governor of New York, he was really a public figure. And the nation was in such terrible shape because the middle class had been completely evaporated after the 1929 crash. Then you had billionaires and you had paupers, and that was about it. but you needed some kind of social plan to pull the people under the wing of the government so that the government would create this dependent class of voters. But the secretaries took the orders directly from the president. So, in essence, what happened was the balance of powers between the legislative and the executive and judicial branches was tilted all in the favor of the executive branch. The president ran everything, and Harry Hopkins ran the president.
That's about it. And indeed, it was like he opened up a foreign office in the White House. Again, taking powers from the State Department, taking powers from the Senate. And when you look at the wartime conferences, whether it was Roosevelt and Churchill or Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, the high-level meetings were with the principals, the actual presidents or dictator, as the case may be, prime minister, and their foreign secretaries. In the American case, the American Secretary of State never, Cordell Hull never participated in a conference. It was always Harry Hopkins. In Yalta, at the end, Cordell Hull was already gone. You did have the American Secretary of State, Edward Stettinius, attend. However, Stettinius was essentially a Hopkins empty suit. He was essentially elevated by Hopkins. He had run Lend-Lease for a time as a figurehead, and he was also enthralled to another man we have not yet mentioned, and his name was Alger Hiss. So at Yalta, even though, yes, there was someone from the State Department, he was a puppet. There's just no question about it. And in the other wartime conferences, the foreign minister for the United States, we don't have such a thing, but the person acting as that was Harry Hopkins.
How about
that?
The
State Department didn't even show up.
Well, now in 1945, a big surprise happens. It surprised the scientists. It surprised the pilots that dropped it. It definitely surprised the Japanese. But I would like to know if you found out in your investigations if it was a surprise to the Soviets when the two bombs went off in Japan, and did they change their plans because of it?
It was not a surprise. And in fact, when Truman spoke to Stalin at Potsdam, which was the conference right after the end of the war in Europe, and told him about the the bomb, he was very completely unsurprised. He seemed to have prior knowledge. Now, I did find something even more interesting than that, because of course Stalin could have just been pretending, I suppose, and trying not to seem shocked about this. But I found...
We know about your little bomb.
There was a... I'm sorry?
I was going to say, I could hear him saying, we know about your little bomb.
Yeah, right, exactly. And he may or may not have been telling the truth. However, there was a very famous wartime correspondent named W.L. White, and he wrote of a 1944 exchange. This was obviously before the detonation of our atomic bomb over Japan, and he wrote of this exchange he had with a Soviet guide. He went over there to write a book about what was going on, and he was being taken around, and his guide was he specifically used the words cyclotrons, splitting of atom, and Manhattan Project in casual conversation.
Wow.
And White had no idea what he was talking about when he said Manhattan Project, and he had this kind of hilarious exchange, thinking, I don't know that club. I mean, you can imagine Manhattan Project. He thought he put it all down to a lack of language miscommunication, and he wrote about that experience later on. Another more evidence about this, again, came from the Lend-Lease supply line. This was something that George Racy Jordan testified about in Congress. He testified twice, once in late 1949 and once again in 1950. He came back essentially to defend his honor at this point because he had been so maligned. One of the things that came up after his first testimony, which of course included charges that Harry Hopkins and the whole Lend-Lease mechanism had been pressuring the delivery of atomic materials through to the Soviet Union. And indeed, General Groves testified that he was under tremendous pressure from the Lend-Lease organization to do the same thing and to be more, compliant. One of the things he discussed was an amazing night in Montana in the winter when his Russian counterparts hosted him for the only time they ever did this in town for kind of a chicken and vodka dinner, okay? And Jordan told the people back at the base, the other Americans, don't let any planes take off for Russia while I'm at dinner. He was getting suspicious at that point. And sure enough, he called up and found out that there was a plane that the Soviets were trying to fly out. And he left the party without saying goodbye and drove careening down the mountain, the Montana empty road, back to the air base in the dark of winter, and ran out onto the tarmac where the plane was revving up, and poked his head up into the plane, and came across these Soviet guards with all of these cheap black suitcases. This is how they carried a lot of their supplies and a lot of their mail, a lot of the stolen records, stolen documents, stolen plans, and so on. And he decided it was going to be that night or never. He was going to look inside and see what they had. And he didn't have gloves. He describes this frigid night, and he starts opening them up. But first, because the pilots are so upset and they're yelling, diplomatique, diplomatique, as if to say you can't touch the diplomatic stuff, he called over a soldier on patrol, an American, and he came running over through the snow, and he said, I'm going to open this baggage, and I want you to watch these two Russians. They're armed. If one of them aims a gun at me, I want you to let him have it first. Understand? And the soldier looked him in the eye and said, Sir, is that an order? And Jordan said, yep, that's an order. So he starts going through the documents, and he sees maps pinpointing American industrial sites, maps of the Panama Canal, documents related to the Aberdeen Proving Ground, which was a very sensitive effort in the war, sensitive area in the war effort, all of this naval and shipping intelligence, papers on oil refineries, machine tools, it goes on, documents from the State Department, documents from the American embassy in Russia that had come back and then were now returning to Russia, to Soviet hands. But then he gets to a very thick map that he testified said Oak Ridge, Manhattan Engineering District. Now, he didn't know what Oak Ridge was. He's just writing this down. And he also found strange papers referring to things with weird words he hadn't heard, cyclotron again, and things about, neutrons and fission, these strange words. And that's where he said for the first time in his life he saw the word uranium. So this is Jordan's testimony about what he saw going through. He also testified that he saw a note with the initials HH saying, had a hell of a time getting these away from Groves, and these were attached to the Manhattan District plans. Now this, he testified to, it became a huge controversy, and mainly Hopkins was dead at this point, and his defenders, of which there were legion, were saying, oh, he never signed his name HH. He always said HLH. Jordan's a fraud, just based on that. And now they didn't allow the investigators from Congress to investigate all the archives to see if they could find an HH. But they did come up with a couple of, many documents perhaps, but a lot of HHs. But they made this huge point about it had to be HLH because Harry Hopkins' middle name began with an L. Well, when I was doing my research, I was in the Georgetown archives. Georgetown University has Harry Hopkins' papers. And I found a couple of very interesting things while I was there. One of them was I found a note signed by Harry Hopkins, H.H.
Oh, so, how about that?
Just for the record, he did sign his name sometimes H.H. But as Jordan said at the time, he said, what, they wouldn't attack me if I had the right initials? That wasn't the basis of it. One of Hopkins' main assistants, who's actually still living, a man named Sidney Hyman, he's about 96 or 7 years old now. He organized Hopkins' papers for the very famous biography that Robert Sherwood wrote about him at this time. It was a huge bestseller one of the Book of the Month Club, big book in the late 40s. Just had come out about a year earlier, and Sidney Hyman told Newsweek that Harry Hopkins, it couldn't have been Harry Hopkins involved in this because Harry Hopkins, quote, didn't know uranium from geranium. Now, I've been through that Hopkins biography so much because it's a very important book, and believe me, Harry Hopkins knew plenty about uranium. Harry Hopkins and Sidney Hyman knew this because he had put the papers together for Sherwood. Harry Hopkins was the liaison between Vannevar Bush, the lead scientist on Manhattan Project, and President Roosevelt, and he was the liaison on the Manhattan Project between President Roosevelt and Winston Churchill, right from the start. He knew everything that was going on and indeed was quite fascinated by it, as the book makes very clear. So here you see a Hopkins crony doing his best to make the story go away, doing his best to make Hopkins unimportant.
It's not unlike what we see this happening in our own government right now. We see cronies in the White House, whether they're in the State Department or whether they're in the press, doing their best to say, oh, that's old news, let it go away. We need to go back to the business of America. And we also see diplomats and other important people being left, behind. So it's still going on today, and we're not learning our lessons. By the way, one of my listeners and friends says that her father, Lieutenant John D. Paulus, Jr., was the designer of the electrical system for the Manhattan Project, and he was told it was a design for a new battleship for planes to land on. And she found his original drawing when he passed away. He never knew about the project until the bomb dropped. So secrecy was held at all kinds of levels. And now you mentioned that that he was testifying. Where was he testifying? Were these congressional hearings that were trying to find out who leaked the information to the Russians and why they were able to blow up a bomb in 1949?
Yes, it was. I can, if you give me 1 second, I can get the exact committee name. It was looking into how this had happened. It was looking into whether there had been espionage, and they, of course, interviewed Jordan because he had claimed and was able to prove he had shipped uranium. He was also able to prove he had shipped heavy water. The congressional investigators were able to find shipping labels. They were able to find the number of the airplane that actually flew it out. When his story broke, he was able to, people came forward with different pieces of confirmation. For example, the pilot, a man named Ben Brown, who flew the uranium out, actually, you'll appreciate this, actually claimed, he didn't have to testify, he just told reporters, that in moving cases around, one of the cases opened up and this brownish grain spilled out, and he started to pick it up. And one of the Russians who was on the flight said, "No, stop, burn hands, don't touch."
Yeah, exactly. That's enriched uranium, and it's pouring neutrons off of it. And that's one of the reasons you use the cadmium or lead, is to absorb those neutrons so that you can contain it while you're transporting it and putting it into cases. Now, not all this stuff left by plane. Some of this, like the aluminum tubes, and you're talking, maybe millions of pounds of stuff that was shipped out. A lot of this went by sea, did it not?
Yes, but a lot of I mean, you hear about shipments of thousands of pounds, 4,000 pounds. One of the confirming corroborators of Jordan's story was a very famous ex-Soviet official named Viktor Kravchenko, who wrote a couple of very, very important books. Most famous, I Chose Freedom. He actually defected from Lend-Lease during the war. And in 1940, I'm trying to remember if it was 43 or 44, he walked out of the Soviet Lend-Lease building on 16th Street in Washington, D.C. one day and never came back. And he had to go underground because the Soviets were after him. Harry Hopkins wanted to find him and considered him a deserter from Russia. He used the word deserter to refer to Kravchenko. Yes. Kravchenko actually discussed in his own testimony before Congress that he had helped the leading kind of tubing scientist of the day for the Soviets. His name was Semenenko. Packing up plans regarding, these tubing experiments that you know so much more about than I do, and even masses of goods that came to thousands of pounds that were shipped out even by airplane. It's kind of extraordinary, but of course there was a lot by boat as well. Some things were also shipped over or by flown to the ports and were taken by boat across. Now, another horrible American betrayal is that some of those boats were also put into service to carry prisoners to the Gulag during the war. Some of them were boats made in America. We called them Liberty ships, and they were, again, part of our war effort. And there are people who believe, and there are people who have attested to this, that there were American servicemen carried on those boats to the Gulag as well.
Get
American
out of
boats.
here. I mean, I really...
Horrible thing.
You mentioned that on C-SPAN, that not only Roosevelt, but also Eisenhower was aware that we had American POWs left behind, not in German POW camps, but in Soviet POW camps.
Yes. This is again something that the evidence points to. This is evidence that actually was amassed by the Senate Foreign Relations Committee on the minority side back around 1990. And they put together a really amazing report that people can read for themselves. I've got the footnote. You can find it online, the entire report. And I've used that report as well as other sources that had confirming information or additional information, different memoirs and so on, that paints a truly, I mean, this is sort of the ultimate betrayal. In fact, it is my ultimate betrayal. Each chapter at a certain point is a different level of betrayal, but there's something about the betrayal of thousands of American soldiers by the government that is, the cruelest cut of all. Essentially, what you had at the end of the war was a completely disintegrating Germany, of course, and the prisoner of war camps were similarly falling apart as the Germans moved west away from the Russians. They were desperate, of course, always to surrender to Americans and British rather than to the Russians, and they were fleeing to the west, and very often they would leave the prisoners behind, and the Soviets would overrun the camps. And at the point you were a prisoner of the Soviets, it was no better, and indeed ended up being worse than being a prisoner of the Germans. There were thousands of them wandering around, trying to find help. Many of them were sick, wounded, and we had negotiators in Moscow working very hard to set up all manner of insertion teams, arrange for American and British planes to come in, pick them up, get them medical help, and so on, of course. But the Russians would not permit this, and we allowed the Russians not to permit this. And the cable exchange between Roosevelt and Stalin, which, again, more archival material that was not available until very recent years, is just a disgusting thing to read. His impotence, his ineffectiveness. You had, on the other hand, our, at that time, ambassador to Russia, Averell Harriman, trying to negotiate his best, getting very frustrated. He had been a Hopkins hire originally, but at this point, he, at least for a period, he was extremely, at least in comparison, he was very strong-minded about trying to make the right deal for our American prisoners, but then he, too, abandoned it. You had the military, the generals, also involved. And there's a description in the cable flow. Again, it's really nothing more than the facts. At the end of May of 1945, after victory in Europe, there's a meeting between the Americans and the Russians. And the chief negotiator was, I believe he was General, but yes, a General Barker. He's negotiating and realizing, and he writes this in the cable, that at a certain point he realizes they're not coming home anytime soon. And they may be used as bargaining chips or something, But you're reading this cable flow and you're thinking, they're not coming home. Now, meanwhile, you had the Americans negotiating and keeping track and getting records and figuring out. The estimates at the end of May were about 15,000 was one estimate out of Moscow, and then Eisenhower's Surgeon General estimated about 20. Maybe the other one. I can't remember it's the right way, but anyway, you had the two authorities at the point of the end of May of 1945 saying 15 to 20,000 Americans. The British estimates were more like 30,000 Commonwealth soldiers. At the end of May, about May 31st, you have another flow of cables, and you all of a sudden have an announcement from 48 hours, 24 hours after this assessment is made by Eisenhower that there are no more prisoners except for stragglers. And then right after that, you have the Undersecretary of War, Robert Patterson, declaring in Washington to the New York Times, everyone who's missing in action that we've been carrying is missing in action. We're changing to killed in action. We don't have any reason to think they're anybody that we've been carrying as possibly alive is alive. End of story.
And they knew. And they knew that all those sons, all those fathers were still alive.
Yes, they did. And the thing of it is, Brooks, is that over time, stories would come out. People who were repatriated, the Soviets had, under the terms of Yalta that we agreed to, they had millions of German slaves for some number of years. This was part of war reparations. Those Germans would come out, or Japanese prisoners would come out, and they would tell our intelligence people. There's a series of files called the Ringer files. They would tell, when they were debriefed, they would tell of Americans that they saw, officers, flyers, young men from Virginia. I mean, they would talk about people they'd seen in the different camps, uranium mines, just horrendous stories that were top secret, were not, of course, brought out. And when this report came out, this Senate report in around 1990, one of the items that they brought to light was that there was, I believe, a Major Thompson was one of the men discussed in these files after the war, 10, 15 years after the war. And his daughter came forward, and she was interviewed, I think it was by the Washington Times, and she said, how could it be that my father was alive and well in the 1950s, and the United States government never told us? We'd been told he was killed in action.
Yeah, and there was no guesswork about it. They knew, and they probably knew pretty much the identities of most of those 15 to 20,000 Americans that were left behind. And, we find it so amazing, so shocking that our current administration would leave an ambassador behind in Benghazi to die. But the strange thing about that is that there were survivors. There were survivors on the ground in Benghazi, and they were removed from there and taken to hospitals in the United States and have supposedly been there for the last 8 months, and no one has been able to speak to them except appointees of the president.
That's true. I know that for a fact is true.
So
it's this notion of elites, our political leaders, and again, we're not even talking about one party versus the other. Eisenhower's a Republican, Truman was a Democrat, Roosevelt, of course, and later on, as the administrations were undoubtedly aware of various prisoner bodies, whether it was Korea, later in Vietnam, which amazingly is the war that is the most famous for this myth, this thought, this reality, we don't even really know, in terms of the public perception of prisoners left behind. And that would be the war that actually left the fewest number behind.
Vietnam.
In Vietnam, right. It's
yeah,
about
exactly.
50,000 Americans in World War II, and about 8,000 believed to be left behind in Korea, a couple thousand during the whole Cold War, and then I think the estimate is around 1,000 to 2,000 after Vietnam. But that was the one that came closest to public perception. And I was so struck when Boris Yeltsin, I looked back at some transcripts between Boris Yeltsin and the first President Bush. Boris Yeltsin, when he became president of that toxic dump known as the former Soviet Union, seemed to be reacting in a fairly human way, to try to understand what had happened and to try to bring it to book, try to bring out what he could. And he actually made statements, made no uncertain terms statements that he believed soldiers had been in the Gulag and that he was trying to figure it out. Well, George Bush, the father, I mean, he might as well have shoved a shoe in Boris Yeltsin's mouth at their little press conference when Yeltsin drops this on the press corps. He just shuts the whole thing down. The whole mission to understand what was in the Gulag in terms of Americans was always a dog and pony show. And when we finally got a report around, 2005 or 6, maybe even 2007 from this commission, that yes, we have an admission from the U.S. government, yes, there were American soldiers in the Gulag, and the estimate was, the man said, well, I'm comfortable saying, I don't know, some hundreds, which I think was not really very accurate, but, you finally get this admission that, yes, they were there, and the government does nothing. There's never any sense of reckoning. You don't have the President of the United States, run up that POW MIA flag one day and say, people, we found this out. I mean, it's like everything just drifts on. And, again, this theme of American betrayal, it is the worst betrayal.
Well, it is, and so let's go back to the beginning of the interview when we're saying that this was not perpetrated by Americans inside America. This was perpetrated by an occupied Washington, D.C. that had hundreds, if not thousands, of Soviet agents working at all kinds of levels in almost every agency, dealing with money, dealing with industrial secrets, dealing with military and weapons secrets. We've already said that the Nagasaki and Hiroshima bombs were no surprise to the Germans, and when it blew up in 1949 and the investigation began, who did they pin it on? The Rosenbergs, who were summarily shot.
Right. It's and that committee, by the way, was called. Oh, I lost the name again. I'll find it again. I thought I brought it up for you.
Well, the point I'm trying to make is if these same activities are going on today, some 50 years later, have all these Soviet agents left, or are they still and generationally embedded now in our government? And this is why we are seeing shenanigans where we are taking stolen weapons from Libya and piping them into Syria so that we can keep on fighting the old Soviet war.
Well, it's interesting you should mention that, because one of the things that becomes very clear, and I first found this out from Stanton Evans' amazing book, Blacklisted by History, which is a new look at Joe McCarthy and shows that he was right. Documents show that he was right. One of the things that Stanton Evans found, and I consider him a mentor of mine, he was very generous with me with his time when I had questions for him when I was embarking on this book. He discovered when he was trying to reassemble a real archive of documents that would give him a way to build the life and times of Joe McCarthy, those documents are gone. Our National Archive is like Swiss cheese.
Really?
Documents, yes, it is absolutely chilling. Someone always seemed to be ahead of Stanton Evans when he was looking for these archival documents. I'm talking about things like in committee investigations that, lists of what they used to call subversives, documents, even the newspapers of the Wheeling, West Virginia newspaper that covered Joe McCarthy's his maiden anti-communist speech in 1950. The newspaper microfilm for that particular span of time is the only newspaper microfilm in the archives of the West Virginia newspaper that are missing. It's just too weird. Everywhere you go, you find that a document is not where it's supposed to be. I found it myself, going back to George Earle, the man who was trying to parley with the anti-Nazi Germans. He had set up, before he left, he was Roosevelt's special emissary, and I found a letter, not where it was supposed to be, where Earle had written to Hopkins saying, basically, Harry, he liked Harry quite a lot. He said, Harry, I like the way you think. I want you to be my conduit to the big boss because, you'll know what's important to show him, basically. This was just as Earle left for his foray in 1943, which is when he was making contact with these German groups. Well, the file where Earl's letters back home to Hopkins in this period where he was having contact with the Germans, it's empty. There aren't any letters in there. I went there. I see it listed in the the library listings, and I'm so excited. I go and I get the archivist to pull the files. I'm sitting there. I open up the magic file. There's nothing there, and there's a little card, a typed little note that says that these letters had been removed. Folder contents were removed. It says previous correspondence to and from Lieutenant Commander George Earl was packed and sent to Mr. Hopkins' home November 22, 1944 for his use.
My goodness.
So I'm thinking he heated his home with it.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking too. Yeah, it either went in the round file. They didn't have shredders in those days, so it just went into the fireplace. Wow, what an interesting hour. Will you stay another?
Sure, why not?
Well, I'm having fun. I hope you are too.
Yes, I am.
Really amazing stuff. Thank you so much. All right, let's take a quick break. Again, get something cold to drink. We'll be back as we're going to go into how does this really affect modern times? What's really going on here? What is the real importance and power of great, I'm going to call it historical, investigative journalism? What is the value of it? We're going to find out in our next hour. Don't go away. More X Squared Radio and Diana West after this.